There is a list. A long list. A list that has been building for decades in American culture through news coverage and Hollywood movies and political speeches and the particular way that one country constructs an image of another country, when those two countries have spent the better part of a century treating each other as the primary threat to everything they value. The list is the things Americans believe about Russia that are wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in the details while being right in the general shape. Wrong in ways that matter. Wrong in ways that affect how two groups of human beings who have never met each other think about each other and treat each other and decide what is possible between them. I am going to go through that list today. I am going to go through it while riding through the city that the list is supposed to be describing. So you can look at what is actually here while I explain what people think is here. And by the end of this video, I think you are going to find that the gap between the two is larger than you expected. Stay with me, because the last item on the list is the one that I think matters most, and it is the one that almost nobody ever talks about. The first thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the danger. Ask most Americans whether they would feel safe walking through Moscow alone at night, and the answer will almost certainly be no. The image of Moscow as a dangerous city, a city where crime is everywhere and where a foreigner alone on the street after dark is taking a serious risk, is so deeply embedded in American popular culture that most people accept it without questioning whether it corresponds to anything real. Here is what is actually real. Moscow is one of the safest major cities in the world by the metrics that matter. The murder rate in Moscow is lower than the murder rate in many major American cities. The robbery rate is lower. The rate of violent crime against strangers is lower. A person walking alone through Moscow at midnight on a Tuesday is statistically safer than a person walking through significant parts of Chicago or Baltimore or Memphis at the same time. I am not saying Moscow has no crime. Every city of 12 million people has crime. I am saying the specific image of Moscow as a place where physical danger lurks around every corner for anyone who looks foreign is not supported by reality. I have walked these streets at every hour of the day and night for my entire life. I have ridden my bicycle through this city at 2 in the morning and at 5 in the morning and at every point in between. The overwhelming majority of those experiences have been completely uneventful in exactly the way that the overwhelming majority of any walk through any reasonably well-functioning city is uneventful. The danger narrative about Moscow serves specific purposes in specific contexts, and those purposes have nothing to do with accurately describing what it is actually like to be a person in this city on an ordinary day, which is mostly fine. Mostly just a city. Mostly just people going about their lives in the way that people in cities go about their lives everywhere. The second thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the poverty. The image of Russia as a uniformly poor country, as a place where people are struggling economically in ways that define the entire experience of living there, is wrong in ways that require some nuance to explain properly, but that are wrong nonetheless. Russia has genuine economic problems. Economic inequality in Russia is significant. There are parts of Russia, regions far from Moscow, that experience real poverty in ways that are serious and that deserve to be taken seriously. None of this is in dispute. What is wrong is the idea that Moscow itself, the city you are looking at right now, is a poor city in the way that American popular culture suggests. Moscow is one of the wealthiest cities in the world by several measures. It has more billionaires per capita than almost any other city on Earth. It has a middle class that, while different in its specific contours from the American middle class, is real and significant, and lives in ways that would surprise Americans who expect Soviet-era deprivation. The shops in Moscow are full. The restaurants in Moscow range from cheap and good to expensive and extraordinary. The infrastructure of the city, the roads, the metro, the parks, the public spaces, has been invested in heavily and consistently over the past 2 decades, and the results are visible everywhere you look. The apartments in central Moscow cost more per square meter than apartments in many American cities. The traffic jams in Moscow are caused by too many people having too many cars, which is not a problem that poor cities typically have. The poverty narrative about Russia, like the danger narrative, is a simplification that flattens the enormous diversity of a country that spans 11 time zones and contains within it everything from genuine deprivation to genuine wealth and everything in between. What you are looking at right now is not deprivation. It is a major world city going about its business on an ordinary morning. The third thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the relationship between Russians and their government. The assumption that most Americans carry, the assumption that is almost never examined because it feels so obvious that examination seems unnecessary, is that Russians and their government are essentially the same thing. That what the Russian government does reflects what Russian people want. That Russian people and Russian foreign policy are one continuous entity that can be discussed as though they were interchangeable. This assumption is wrong in ways that are so fundamental that I barely know where to start explaining it. Let me try this way. Think about the last American election that you did not vote for the winner of. Think about the policies that the winning administration pursued that you disagreed with. Were you and your government the same thing during that period? Were you and the decisions made in your name by people you did not choose interchangeable? Were you responsible for everything done in your name? The answer is obviously no. And the same answer applies here. The Russian government makes decisions. Russian people live their lives. The relationship between those two things is complicated and contested, and varies enormously from person to person and from issue to issue, and is not accurately described by collapsing the two into one. The woman buying bread on that corner has opinions about her government that are her own, and that are not identical to her government's opinions about itself. The man walking to the metro this morning has a relationship with the decisions made in his name that is as complicated and as full of disagreement and resignation and frustration and occasional pride as any citizen's relationship with their government anywhere in the world. Treating Russians as synonymous with the Russian state is a mistake that has real consequences for how people in different countries understand each other and what they think is possible between them. The fourth thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the history, and specifically the Second World War. Most Americans know that the Soviet Union was involved in the Second World War. Most Americans know, in the vague way that you know things that were mentioned briefly in a history class and not returned to, that the Eastern Front was significant and that the Soviet Union suffered large casualties. The actual numbers and the actual scale of what those numbers mean for how Russians understand themselves and their history and their relationship with the concept of war and peace are almost entirely absent from American popular understanding of this period. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the Second World War. 27 million. The United States lost approximately 400,000. Both of these losses were real and significant, and both deserve to be mourned. But the scale is different in ways that change everything about how the two countries have experienced the legacy of that war. In Russia, almost every family lost someone. Not every family in the abstract statistical sense. Almost every actual family, every specific collection of grandparents and parents and children and cousins, lost a specific person whose name they know and whose photograph they have, and whose absence shaped the family in ways that are still felt today. The May 9th holiday, Victory Day, is the most important holiday in Russia. More important than New Year. More important than anything else. It is not a celebration in the American sense of the word. It is something more complicated. A day of grief and pride and memory and gratitude and the particular solemnity of a people who know what was paid for the world they live in. Americans who visit Moscow on May 9th and see the crowds and the flowers and the photographs of the dead being carried through the streets often find it moving in ways they did not expect, because they encounter something they rarely encounter in American public life. A genuine, unperformed, collective memory of real loss. That memory shapes how Russians think about war and peace and safety and the cost of things, in ways that are invisible to people who have not been formed by it. The fifth thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the culture. The assumption is that Russian culture is heavy, is serious, is the culture of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Shostakovich and everything that implies, which is to say a culture of suffering and depth and meaning, and not very much lightness. This assumption is half right and entirely misleading. Yes, The Russian cultural tradition contains extraordinary depth and extraordinary suffering and works of art that engage with the darkest aspects of human experience with a directness and an honesty that is genuinely overwhelming. This is real. Dostoevsky is real. The weight of the great Russian novels is real. The particular heaviness of Shostakovich is real and earned and cannot be argued with. But a culture is not only its greatest and most serious works. A culture is also its jokes and its popular songs and its memes and its Saturday afternoon pleasures and its ways of wasting time happily and its relationship with the ordinary and the light and the funny and the absurd. Russian popular culture is enormous and varied and alive and largely invisible outside Russia because of the language barrier and because the serious tradition is so dominant in how Russia presents itself to the world. The films of Leonid Gaiday, the Soviet comedy director whose films are still watched and quoted by everyone from teenagers to their grandparents, are genuinely funny in ways that cross cultural boundaries once you understand the context. The tradition of the bard, of the singer-songwriter performing their own poetry, produced figures like Vladimir Vysotsky, whose recordings were passed hand-to-hand on cassette tapes because they were not officially approved, and whose songs are still quoted in conversation by people who were not born when they were written. Contemporary Russian internet culture produces memes and jokes and cultural references that travel through Russian-speaking communities around the world with the speed of anything that is genuinely funny and genuinely shared. The culture is not only its heaviest expression, the culture is also its lightness. And the lightness is real and it is present. And it is one of the things that makes living here genuinely enjoyable in ways that the serious tradition does not fully prepare you for. The sixth thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the relationship between Russians and winter. The assumption is that winter in Russia is primarily a form of suffering, that Russians endure it because they have no choice, that the cold is an obstacle that the culture has learned to manage rather than something that has been genuinely integrated into how people live and what they value. This is wrong in an interesting way. Russians do not merely survive winter, they have a relationship with it. A complicated, long-established, genuinely affectionate relationship that includes all the things you would expect, the appropriate clothing and the preparation and the particular foods that are for winter and not for other seasons, but that goes beyond management into something more like appreciation. The Russian banya, the bathhouse, is not primarily about hygiene, although it serves that purpose. It is about the specific pleasure of being very hot, and then very cold, and then very hot again in a way that produces a physical and psychological state that Russians describe as feeling new. The banya in winter, when the cold outside is genuine and biting and the heat inside is extreme, and the option of going outside into the snow is available, and is sometimes taken and is experienced as wonderful rather than punishing, is one of the specific pleasures of Russian winter that has no equivalent in warmer climates. The particular beauty of Moscow under snow is something that Russians genuinely notice and genuinely appreciate. The light is different. The city is quieter. The spaces between things are cleaner and more defined. The parks that in summer are green and crowded are in winter white and still and beautiful in a completely different way that requires winter to exist, and that would not be possible without it. Russians who move to warmer climates often miss winter in ways that surprise people who have never experienced a genuine one. Not the cold, specifically, but the completeness of it. The sense that the world has a full range of states, and that you are living through all of them, rather than a comfortable middle portion of the range. There is something important in that completeness that I think is difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it, and impossible to fully appreciate without the contrast that genuine cold provides. The seventh thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the relationship between Russians and their history. The assumption is that Russians are either proud of all of their history, or ashamed of all of it, or simply do not think about it very much. The reality is that the relationship is active and contested and ongoing, and differs significantly from person to person and generation to generation, and that this complexity is one of the most interesting things about the culture if you are paying attention. Russians argue about their history. They argue about it in kitchens and in university seminars, and in the comment sections of online publications, and in the conversations that happen between generations when the older generation tries to explain to the younger generation what things were actually like, and the younger generation tries to understand something they did not live through. The Soviet period is not uniformly condemned or uniformly celebrated in Russian culture. It is argued over. It produced real achievements in science and education and art and infrastructure, and it produced real atrocities in the Gulag and the purges and the famines and the silencing of everything that the system found threatening. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the culture has not resolved the tension between them because the tension is real and does not resolve easily. Stalin is the most complicated figure in Russian popular historical consciousness. Surveys of Russian historical figures consistently show him near the top of lists of important or admirable historical figures, and simultaneously there is a genuine and widespread understanding of the scale of the crimes committed under his rule. These two things coexist in the culture in ways that are difficult for people outside the culture to understand, because they seem contradictory. They are not contradictory. They are the natural result of a history that is genuinely complicated, and that has not been resolved into a simple narrative because simple narratives cannot contain it. The engagement with history that you see in Russian culture, the arguing and the disagreement and the inability to settle on a single story about what the past means, is a sign of a living relationship with the past rather than a dead one. And a living relationship with the past, even a painful and complicated one, is healthier than no relationship at all. The eighth thing Americans get wrong about Russia is the role of women. The image of Russian women in American culture is specific and limiting and wrong in almost every direction simultaneously. The reality is both simpler and more complex than the image. Russian women have historically had access to education and professional life in ways that predate similar access in many Western countries. The Soviet system, whatever its many failures, pushed women into professional roles and higher education from its earliest decades. The result is a female population with extremely high rates of university education and professional achievement that is largely invisible in the cultural image that circulates outside Russia. Russian women work. They work in medicine and engineering and law and science and education and every other field in proportions that often exceed those of comparable Western countries. They also maintain domestic and family responsibilities in ways that reflect a culture that has not fully resolved the tension between professional equality and domestic expectation. This tension is not unique to Russia. It exists everywhere that women have entered professional life without a corresponding shift in domestic arrangements. In Russia, the tension is real and ongoing and is a subject of active discussion and disagreement, particularly among younger women. What is wrong is the image that reduces Russian women to a single type defined by appearance and availability, and a presumed desire to leave Russia for somewhere better. The women on this street are people. Complicated, educated, professionally capable, domestically engaged, culturally sophisticated, often funny, frequently frustrated, occasionally extraordinary people who are living their lives in a place that is theirs, and that they have not universally decided they want to leave. The ninth thing Americans get wrong about Russia is how Russians feel about America. The assumption, fed by decades of Cold War framing and recent political tension, is that Russians hate America or fear America, or are at minimum deeply hostile to American culture and American people. The reality, which is more nuanced and more interesting and more hopeful than the assumption, is that most Russians have a complicated and frequently affectionate relationship with American culture that coexists with disagreement about American foreign policy in ways that Americans often find surprising. Russian young people grew up with American movies and American music and American fashion and American technology in ways that created genuine cultural connections that political disagreements have not fully severed. The appreciation for American jazz and American cinema and American literature that exists in Russian cultural life is real and has deep roots. Mark Twain is beloved in Russia. Jack London is beloved in Russia. American jazz has had devoted Russian audiences since the Soviet period when it was officially frowned upon, and people sought it out precisely because it was forbidden and therefore interesting. The political hostility that exists at the governmental level between Russia and America is real and significant, and I am not going to minimize it. But the hostility between governments is not the hostility between peoples, and the difference between those two things matters enormously. Most Russians who encounter actual Americans, rather than the abstraction of America that exists in political discourse, find them perfectly likable, and are frequently surprised to discover that actual Americans are similarly surprised to find them likable in return. Because both sides have been told a story about the other side that turns out, on actual contact, to be mostly wrong. The 10th thing Americans get wrong about Russia, the last thing, the most important thing, the thing I want you to sit with after this video ends, is the simplest thing. Americans get wrong the basic humanness of Russians. Not intellectually. Intellectually, everyone knows that Russians are human beings, but culturally, in the deep structural way that culture shapes what we actually feel, rather than what we know we should feel. The image of Russia that American culture has constructed over decades is not an image of human beings. It is an image of a threat, of a system, of an abstraction, of something that needs to be understood strategically and responded to geopolitically and accounted for in defense budgets and discussed in terms of interests and capabilities and intentions. All of that analysis may have its place in the specific contexts where it belongs, but it does not have a place in how one group of human beings understands another group of human beings at the basic level of recognizing each other as human. The people on this street are human. They are exactly as human as you are. They have the same range of qualities, the same capacity for kindness and smallness and generosity and pettiness and love and fear and hope and everything else that being human includes. They are doing their best in a place that has asked a great deal of its people and whose people have kept showing up anyway. They are not their government. They are not their history. They are not their stereotype. They are people. On a street, on a Tuesday morning, going about their lives, and that is the thing that I most want you to understand when you watch this video. Not any specific fact about Russia, not any specific correction to any specific misconception. Just that, just the people, just the humanness. Everything else follows from getting that right. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing it. Come back next week. There is always more. And leave a comment below. Tell me which one of these surprised you most. I read every single one, and I will answer you.